Hey everybody, welcome to class. Frank Markow, your nutty professor here. And you're probably wondering, why am I wearing a hat today when I usually don't wear a hat? Well, because this hat belongs to one of my favorite teams, which is Team Fender. Now, maybe you have a different team that you like to follow. Maybe you're a Dodgers fan, or maybe you're a Raiders fan. But let's face it, we all love to follow teams, don't we? Whether it's a sports team or whether it's a musical instrument manufacturing team, as is the case here. Teams are a pervasive part of our life today, and not just professional sports team, but this whole idea of teams has trickled down into the way we think about organizing and has some strong implications for the topic of this class, which is organizational behavior. So this week what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the topic of that's right, groups and teams. We're going to look at groups and teams. What's the difference between a group and a team? Is every group a team? Are all teams groups? What are the essential elements of groups? What are the essential elements of teams? How do we make teams function better? And we're going to talk about these topics and a lot more. So hang on to your hat. Now, before we get into my bit about groups and teams, I want you to see a good example of teamwork in action. Check this out.
That way is our best bet.
You want to go toward the people that tried to kill us?
If it means land, yes.
Do you expect us to swim there?
I expect you to trust me.
The robot's in the financial district. Which exit do I take?
Traction Avenue.
That'll take me downtown. I take 7, don't I?
Don't take 7!
Great! We missed it!
You asked me how to get there, and I told you. Exit at Traction.
That'll take me downtown.
He's coming up. Get in the right lane.
We don't exit at Traction!
You're gonna miss it!
Violet?
Go! Frozone! Yeah! Go on! Hey, Zone.
Now, wasn't that fun? We all love The Incredibles, an awesome example of a family as a team. And what you'll see in that example is different people brought different abilities and strengths to the team, didn't they? You'll also see that they had to work together, they had to trust their leadership, and sometimes they had to bring in outside help to help them accomplish their goal of defeating that giant, black, scary, mine-looking thing or whatever that was. So, a simple example, maybe a silly example, but like I said, we're going to talk all about groups and teams this week, so hang on. Let's get her done. Now, we often have these fun examples and thoughts about teams, right, don't we? People working together, people pulling together on the same side with a common goal. And maybe you even have this poster up in your office somewhere, right? Teams. Together, everyone achieves more. Or maybe you have this poster up on your wall. Teamwork, overcoming differences to work towards a common goal. Or maybe you have this poster up on your wall. Teamwork, large ambitious goals usually require that people work together. Now, I doubt you have this poster up on your wall, or that you have this poster up on your wall. But these are examples of people working together, using their respective strengths or weights, as it might be the case, or abilities. Now, I know this one's a little bit disturbing. And we all pitch in and we all help each other to get the job done. Whether it's dirty work like this poor guy here going down into this hole, or whether it's puppies pushing up a small baby, oh my gosh, or this one here, aw, everyone said, aw, the hamster's bringing a flower down to the other hamster. So, let's talk about some serious issues here for a moment. Now, groups and teams are not the same. A group is two or more individuals interacting with each other to accomplish a common goal. A team is also a group, but it's a mature group with member interdependence and motivation to achieve a common goal. So teams start out as groups, but not all groups mature into teams. So a way of saying this might be all teams are groups, but not all groups are teams. So groups and teams are similar in a lot of ways, but teams are mature groups that have a different way of working together than just groups do. And we'll talk about that next. Now this chart here shows the difference between groups and teams. So the goals of a formal work group, they work on common goals, but a team has a total commitment to common goals. Now the accountability of a group is typically to the manager or the leader. The accountability to a team is to the team members and the team leader. The skill levels of a formal work group are random. As we're a team, they're complementary. The performance evaluation for a group is typically by the manager. The performance evaluation for a team is by the team members and the team leader. The culture of the formal work group is marked by change and conflict. The culture of the team is based on collaboration and goal attainment. And so you'll see here there's some important difference. I think that the main takeaway here is that teams, the leadership, the goals, the motivation, and even the rewards are done by the team themselves. So a lot of organizations are formed by departments, but there's typically an outside manager who sets the goals, who sets the rewards, who punishes, those sorts of things. With a team, though, all those decisions are made by the team itself. And so I think this is an important decision because nowadays we like to use that term team, right? This is my team, or we're a team. But you may be a team, or you may just be a group. And so chances are, if you have a bunch of people working for you and you are making the decisions about how they do that work and you are rewarding them and motivating them, chances are they're a group with you as the leader. If the team itself is collaborating, has either an internal team leader, does shared decision making, motivates each other, has a strong sense of commitment to one another and to the accomplishment of the goal, that's probably more of a team dynamic going on right there. Now let's talk a little bit about the nature of groups. The minimum requirements for a group to exist is there's got to be two or more individuals, a common goal to be accomplished, some form of exchange or communication between these individuals. So you'll see there has to be some togetherness, right? Now you might say, well, what about just a bunch of people standing on an elevator? Is that a group? No. Why is that not a group? Those are a bunch of individuals in proximity to each other, but there's two or more individuals, so they meet that criteria, but do they have a common goal? You might say maybe to get to the top floor or the bottom floor. Is that a common goal? Maybe. But there has to be some form of exchange or communication. And that's where it breaks down, because we all know that when we get an elevator, we close our mouths, we all face forward, we look up, we wait for our number to pop up, and that's it. There's rarely any communication, right? Unless, of course, the elevator breaks down in the middle of the floor, right? Then all of a sudden we start to look at each other and talk to each other and say, how do we get out of this thing alive? And somebody says, here, you pick up that phone over there and dial for help. Let's see if somebody can pop up to the top there and crawl out through the next floor, right? So somebody gets down on the ground, somebody stands on their back, sort of like that one picture we saw, right? So teamwork or groupness might actually break out in the case of a crisis. But generally speaking, strangers in proximity to each other are not a group. Now, let's talk about some group basics. There's what's called the task dimension, which is the relationship between the group members and the work they are to perform, the job they have to do, and how they get it done. And then there's the social dimension. It's the relationship of the group members to one another and how they feel about each other and their membership in the group. And then there's a third dimension, which is called group cohesion, which is the ability to get along, be loyal, and committed to the group. And it's known that group cohesion is usually positively related to group productivity, right? So a group that gets along better is going to be more effective. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Now this model here shows a lot of the different dimensions of team, group formation and development. And if you had to have a at a glance overview of teams and groups. I'm sorry, I use those interchangeably, but I want to stick with the term group for now because we haven't quite got to teams yet. So this is a good overview of the entire topic right here. Now, there's different types of groups. There's your formal group and your informal groups. Formal groups can be things like command groups. This was the example that I mentioned earlier, where you typically have a leader outside of the group who's overseeing the responsibilities and the roles of the group. Or a task group, a group that's brought together for a specific type of task. Maybe it's a focus group, maybe it's a project, but they're just sort of a temporary group brought together. And then there's a team, and we'll talk more about teams in just a bit. You also have a distinction between informal groups and formal groups. And the informal groups are things like interest groups, right? And friendships. So when you get together with people just on the side, which has no particular goal other than the goal of being together and enjoying something specific, right? So it's not necessarily there to accomplish anything, but people like to form groups, clubs, Bible studies, right? There's a lot of reasons why people get together to hang out in groups for the friendship and the collegiality. It kind of meets a social need, not necessarily a productivity need, right? So maybe you're bowling buddies, you're a group, or if you're in a biker gang, or maybe you're in a softball league and you get together, or maybe you're part of a book club or something like that, right? So these are more informal interest, friendship groups rather than groups that are trying to get something accomplished. Now, groups go through stages in their development, and this is an important model for you to understand. Now, this was originally developed by a guy named Tuckman, and there's 5 stages here that groups go through when the people are first trying to get together. Okay, so imagine, all right, I want you to put yourself in a situation where you're imagining that you're showing up to a group for the very first time, right? Let's just say it's, let me give you something maybe you can relate to. It's a missions outreach team, right? And you guys are all going to go to Guatemala for 2 weeks, and you're going to do some ministry and some outreach, and it's going to be awesome, all right? So that's where you are. You're showing up, and they're called the very first meeting at the church, and you already put down your money, right? You put down your deposit, and this is the first time you're ever going to meet these people in the group leader. So let's think about that scenario as we're going through some of these stages of group development. Now, the first stage is what's called forming. The group forms and the situation is uncertain and disorganized, right? So as you're sitting around and people are talking and maybe the leader's sharing and he puts you together in small groups, you're not really sure what your role is. You're not really sure if you even like these people yet. It's like, I can't believe I got to spend 2 weeks with these people. The only thing we have in common at this point is that we all want to go to Guatemala together. So it's kind of formalized, and people are not really sharing a whole lot. It's really more leader-led at that point, right? And so you're just getting oriented, and it's sort of this formal, let's see how this thing goes kind of stage. Now, the next stage is what's called storming. And this is there's turbulence, disruption, and frustration is at the highest level. So this is the point where you decide, okay, I'm in, I'm going to commit to this thing. And as such, people are going to know what I think about things. I'm going to share my opinions. I'm going to share my thoughts. I'm going to bring my skills and my personality and my gifts and everything to the table because I'm part of this. Now, what happens when you do that? Well, you're going to run into other people who have other ideas, right? Other skills, other abilities. Or maybe they want to do the same thing that you want to do. Let's just say you show up and you bring your guitar with you, right? And there's 3 other guys and they bring their guitars and you're thinking to yourself, I wanted to be the guitar player for the outreach ministry. And these 3 other guys are all thinking the same thing. So now you're like, oh, well, I actually can play better than you and I know a lot more songs than you. Hello. And they're thinking, yeah, but you're kind of old. You probably know songs like from back in the 70s. Now, I think I'm divulging too much information about myself here in this illustration, but you get the idea, right? So now there can be some conflict and disruption as people seek to form their place, their role, and their identity in the group, okay? So this is a natural occurrence, and sometimes we kind of get afraid at this point. We're like, oh man, this isn't going to work out. I'm not going to fit. Or if you're the leader of the group, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I got a lot of conflict going on here. People are like, they're not sure where they're going to fit in, and people have different opinions about things, right? Hang tight, leader. We're going to talk about your role in just a minute. Now, the next stage is what's called norming. This is where we share vision. We genuinely share vision, values, goals, and expectations, and deviations are not welcome. So now everybody settles down. Okay, maybe I won't be the guitar player, but they need somebody to set up the equipment. So I'm going to be the guy that sets up the equipment. That guy, he's a better guitar player, and maybe he'll lead and I'll play along with him. But I'm okay with my role here now. I found something to do. I'm good at this. I like to do this. I can make a contribution to the group. And so everybody starts to settle in and say, okay, yeah, this feels good now. We're on the same page. We're all working together. We all share the vision and the goals. And that's how it goes. And then the next stage is what's called performing. Roles are specific, goals are clear, and results are noticed. So this is where you're kind of humming along, right? So you're not just in that room anymore, right? But you've had a bunch of practices. You're on the field. You've been doing this thing for a few weeks. You're coming down to the middle of your second week, and you guys are like a well-oiled machine. You're humming along. Everybody's performing. Everybody knows their role. Everybody knows what's expected. The leader almost doesn't have to be there. Except for to pay for the food, right? And to make sure you guys get to the next place safely. So everybody's working along and it's working good. And then there's adjourning, which is an orderly disbanding. Now this is kind of, when the whole trip is over and you're all coming back and you're at the airport and everybody's like, I'm not going to see you again. 2 months ago I didn't even like you, but now you're my best friend in the whole world. How are we going to get along? How am I going to live without you, right? So it's kind of this bittersweet time of, man, we just had the best experience of our lives, but now we're not going to see each other, and we're kind of sad because we established some really good relationships, and we had a real peak moment together. We really shared an important time and season in our lives. Okay, so that is an example, and maybe a little bit exaggerated, but if you've ever been part of a group, you can probably relate to some of those dynamics, that kind of formal getting together and then figuring it out and a little bit of conflict and then performing and then kind of saying goodbye at the end of the day. Those are the stages of group formation. Now, if you're the leader of the group, you have a different task in all these stages. And your task will vary as the group moves through the various stages. The leader needs to facilitate healthy group development by acting differently at different stages. Okay, so if you can imagine, let's go back to stage 1. People are getting to know each other. What do you think the leader's role is at that point? Well, at that point, you need to outline goals, right? Vision, get people excited, and you need to facilitate people getting to know each other. You need to do icebreakers. You need to do some sort of social activity that's not related to the goal per se, but let people get comfortable being there, because that's part of the dynamic. People show up and they're strangers. They may know each other a little bit, but they're going to get to know each other quickly. The leader's role is to help them get to know each other so that they're simply comfortable with being with the other people in the group. Now, during the storming stage, you might say, well, what's the job there? Am I to make decisions or to stifle the conflict? No. And this is the hardest part for a lot of leaders, especially you codependent ones, right? Because you don't like conflict. You don't like things to get out of hand, especially you control people, right? But you have to let those things happen. Now, of course, no throwing things or fights or anything like that, but let people disagree and let people work things out and resist the urge to try to solve their problems, because they have to figure this out. They have to go through this bit of conflict here. If you resort to solving all the problems and quashing the conflict, you're going to present problems later on, right? So you may sweep the dirt under the rug, but somebody's going to trip over that bump in the rug later on. You like that illustration? You can use that one if you want. So let it happen and trust the process, right? Trust the Lord and trust the process that eventually people are going to move past that stage to the performing. What's your role at performing? Clarify goals, encourage people, motivate people, get them the resources that they need. And the same in the performing, right? And at the performing stage, here's where you might do some assessment and evaluation. Say, hey, we've been doing this for a while now and it's good, but I think we could do it a little better. What do you guys think about changing this, changing that, right? So you're doing some assessment, you're recommending some changes to even increase the performance even more. That's your role. And then adjournment, what's your job? Well, I don't know. You throw a nice going away lunch or dinner for everybody. Maybe you have a meeting for everybody in a week and you all get together. Now that's always weird when you get back together with people that you've been on a trip with, right? It's like, you've seen people in their grubbies and the girls don't have any makeup on and the guys haven't shaved in 2 weeks, and then you get together and everybody's like clean shaven and everybody put their makeup back on and nice clothes. Like, well, who are these people? I don't even recognize these people, right? And it doesn't feel quite the same, right? When you're kind of back at a restaurant or back at a church or back at somebody's house. It's nice to see everybody, but that dynamic's kind of gone. So in the adjourning phase, what is your role? It's just to simply bring some closure, help people to say goodbye to one another. Something I always like to do is say, hey, make sure you give everybody in the group a big hug and tell them you're praying for them, right? And just let people just go around the room and say goodbye to each other. That's an important thing to do. And of course, you can always send thank you cards. That's always a nice gesture too. Now, another thing here is what's called Hill's model of team leadership. And you'll talk more about this in your leadership class, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. But what Hill's model suggests is that a team leader, first of all, decides whether the problem, if there's a situation that needs to be addressed. And this, by the way, this isn't necessarily in the formation, but this is just a leader's job in a group situation, facilitating a healthy group, is whether or not they need internal or external help, right? So is it a group situation that's going on? Is it a dynamic, a decision? Or is it external? Does the group need resources? Do they need help from another part of the organization? That kind of thing, internal versus external. And then the other role is deciding whether to monitor or take action, right? Sometimes you just need to let things play out a little bit and see how the team handles the situation themselves. You don't always have to take action, right? Sometimes you do have to take action, but not always. So one of your key decisions is to say, is this something that I think is going to figure out if I give a little more time? Or give a minimal of input, or do I need to take action right away? And again, resist that urge to rush in and to be the hero, especially if it's a team situation. They have to learn how to figure things out. People have to learn how to make decisions as a group to come to consensus and all those sorts of things without necessarily leaning upon you. And this is an important leadership development approach as well. For those of you that like to raise other people up in leadership, you got to let some of this stuff take place. You have to let people learn how to make decisions, come to consensus, solve their own problems, figure things out, to be happy with each other, comfortable with each other, right? So if you rush in there and solve all your problems, it's like, like your kid, you treat somebody like a kid, like they're 5 years old their entire life. Like a parent who always has to solve their problems. Your kid's 25 and you're still solving all his problems for him. Well, guess what? That kid's never going to grow up, right? So we treat our groups and our teams sort of in a way that allows them to grow and flourish according to their stage in life and their maturity and those sorts of things. All right. So monitor, take action. That's an important dynamic decision to make as well as a team leader. Now, another dynamic in groups is what's called status hierarchy. Status is typically a consequence of characteristics that differentiate one position from another. A person is sometimes given status because of job seniority, age, or assignment. Assigned status may have nothing to do with the formal status hierarchy. The status hierarchy can have unintended and undesirable effects on performance. Subordinates may be reluctant to challenge those in charge even when necessary, right? So this has to do with perhaps the informal side of leadership, right? So we know that leaders can be formally appointed in a group, but we also know that leaders emerge within a group even without having been appointed. And why is that? Because they have a certain status in the eyes of the group members based on some of these things, their age, seniority, the wisdom, knowledge, all those kinds of things that individuals bring to a group. And the challenge here, as this slide would suggest, is that this status hierarchy can have unintended and undesirable effects on performance. And why is that so? You might be thinking, well, I don't understand that. Well, imagine that you have, let's just say, kind of a common, church situation. You form a group, you serve a missions group, something like that, and guess who comes? One of the senior pastors, one of the senior executive pastors. Maybe it's not the senior pastor himself, him or herself, but it's somebody who has a lot of status in the church, right? And they show up and they decide they want to be part of the group. And you're like, wow, this is cool. But on the other hand, what's going to happen? You're going to defer to that person a lot. You're not going to say anything, right? So it's going to change the whole group dynamics because of this the status imbalance that's now taking place. And furthermore, this person may not know as much as somebody else. So let's just say the team leader's done a lot of missions trips, and this other person comes and he's a senior person in the church, but he doesn't know anything about missions. And so now people are going to defer to him, and the missions leader's going, I can see some problems here. I respect this person, but, I've done a lot of these missions trips here. So it can create some tension there because of the status distinctions. Now, group member roles. There's what's called the expected role, what the organization expects somebody to do on that group. There's the perceived role, what the group member thinks they're supposed to do. And then there's the enacted role, what they actually do, right? And so the goal here is to align all those things. So if you have an organization with a group and you expect somebody to be a member, you need to make it clear what their expectations are. And sometimes people they're confused about their roles, right? They haven't been made clear what they're supposed to do, or maybe they don't have the skills and the background and the capacity to do that role that you think they can and should be doing, right? So as the leader, you need to help align all those things between what's expected, what they think their role is, and what's enacted. Because if you don't, you're going to have a big problem, right? The organization is expecting them to do this, they're thinking they're supposed to do that, and what they really do is like somewhere here in between. Right? Okay, so help people align all of these role expectations and you'll be in good shape. Now let's talk about group norms. Norms are the standards shared by a group members, formed only with respect to things that have significance for the group, may be communicated in writing or verbally, accepted in various degrees by group members, used to regulate member behavior, and may apply to all members or only some. So norm is sort of like what we expect to happen here, what we value, the way we do things. This is kind of like culture in a microcosm, right? So remember we talked about culture has to do with assumptions and values and norms and all those sorts of things. So norms have to do with the expected behavior of a group. Now, maybe something that's written down, in a policy, but chances are it's going to be something that's just sort of developed over time. So getting back to our missions our missions group, right? It may be a norm that you're going to be at every meeting and you're going to be there early and we're going to meet every week and we need you to be there because there's a lot of things we have to learn. And somebody might say, well, I can't be there this week. I'm only going to be there every other week. I've been on a missions trip before. I don't need to go every week. Okay, so you're breaking the norms of the group. People kind of look at you and like, what is this guy, prima donna? He doesn't have to come to all the meetings. Why don't you have to come to meetings? I have to come to the meetings, right? And so now there's all this kind of, bickering about the person that doesn't show up, right? So when you violate the norms of the group, there's going to be problems. There's going to be tension, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's norm conformity. Why employees conform to group norms is an issue of concern to managers. Variables which influence conformity: personal characteristics, situational factor, intergroup relationships, and cultural factors. So we just talked about some of these things. So there's reasons why people conform and don't conform. And let's face it, some of us are non-conformists. I'm not going to go along. I'm not going to do it. I'm special. I'm different. I don't have to do it, right? That's the attitude of the non-conformist, right? So the leader's challenge, like, how do I get this guy on the team here? How do I get this guy to be part of the team and live up to the expectations of the team? Now, this is a hypothetical production norm in its zone of acceptance. Wow, what does all that mean? Okay, what it means is that we expect people to perform within a certain zone, right? This blue zone here, this is the group norm, right? So people are performing really well. Now, what this says up here, what happens if people perform even better, right? These are what they call rate busters, or producing above the group norms, right? So you can see a situation, an organization where somebody, let's just say, typically we're a work group and we produce, let's just say we make cars. Okay, let's get out of the church example for a second. Let's just say we make cars, or let's just say we manufacture, some kind of item, right? Let's say we make furniture, we make cabinets, something like that. Now, as a group, I can produce 5 things a week, and Joe can produce 5 things a week. But here comes, Sam, and he's doing 10 things a week. And the manager starts looking at Sam and saying, yeah, Sam, you go. And he looks at you and says, hey, he can make 10 a week. How come you can't make 10 a week? Now, what happens there? All of a sudden now, there's a bit of a tension because this guy is breaking the norms of the group. We don't want to work that hard. right? And so Sam, we have to gotta reel him down and say, look, pal, maybe 6, but you start making 10, we're all going to get in trouble here. So we want you to slow it down. Now on the other side, if you look down here, are people that don't produce at all. And these are what are called the social loafers, or today we call them slackers, right? And these are people that don't produce according to what is needed. And so we also kind of look askance to those people as well, and we say, hey, you know what? You're not doing your part of the group here. You're not doing your part of the norm. What's expected of you. Now this happens a lot, like in, when students try to get together and the teacher gives them assignments, right? And everybody's working really hard and they're doing their homework and doing their activities, and then you show up and like, this guy hasn't done anything, and he's like, why do I need to work? I got 5 other really smart people on my team here. I'm going to let them do all the work, right? So that's not a good situation, right? He's also violating the norms. Okay, so the goal here is to get all your people kind of in that sweet spot where they're not working super hard and making the rest of you look like idiots, or he's working super low and making you guys carry, the load for him, right? Kind of getting in that zone of acceptance. Now, let's talk about group leadership. Now, as we know, leaders exert influence over group members. In formal groups, leaders can reward or punish members who do not conform to the orders or rules. A formal group may have no formal leader. Autonomous work groups, self-managed teams. An informal group leader generally is respected and high-status member who embodies the values of the group, helps the group accomplish its goals, enables members to satisfy its needs. The leader receives and interprets communication relevant to the group. All right, so sometimes leadership is formally appointed, and as we mentioned earlier, sometimes leadership emerges because of one's status in a group. And you've probably been in a situation where a bunch of people are thrown together and there wasn't really a leader per se, but somebody emerged. Somebody had a special ability, a special pizzazz or charisma where everybody said, yeah, that guy, we're going to let him or her be the leader of the group, right? So maybe not even stated as much, but it just sort of in time happens. And another dynamic that happens in groups too is that people emerge as leaders in specific areas. Now, as we mentioned, one of the important dynamics of groups is the social dimension. So sometimes you have people that are really good on the task, and they're sort of the task drivers, and they get everybody to get the task done. But then you have people that have an expertise or ability, a gift, if you will, to get people to work together, and they show concern for people. Hey, what happened to her? What happened to him? They haven't shown up in a while. I'm going to get on the phone. I'm going to send an email and figure out what happened, right? So there's sort of like that social glue that helps people hold together. Now, we'll talk about team roles in a bit here, but you might see yourself in either of those. If you're more of a task person, you might say, yeah, I'm really concerned that the group gets the task done. If you're more of a people person, right, you might be really more concerned about the group dynamics and people getting along and people fitting in. So you might emerge as a leader in one of those particular capacities. Now, let's talk about group cohesiveness, which is defined as a closeness or commonness of attitude, behavior, and performance. It acts on members to remain in a group, and it's greater than the forces pulling members away from the group. Now, what are some of the sources of group attraction? Well, goals of the group and members are compatible, right? I want to be part of this group. I like what they do. A charismatic leader can also be a strong pull to keep people together in a group. A good reputation for accomplishing tasks. Think about it. If this team is a winning team, everybody wants to be on that team. If they're growing, if things are happening, you can bet that people want to stay and be part of that team. The group is small enough to permit members to have their opinions heard, and members support and help one another. And this is important too in group dynamics in terms of the size, right? If a group is so big that people don't feel like they have an important role, then chances are they're going to check out. They're not going to feel as committed. Sort of going back to my example, the first night of the missions team and 3 guys show up with their guitar. They might say, well, that was really what I wanted to do as part of the group. I guess I don't need to be part of this, or I'll go along, but I'm going to be like whatever, right? So you, as a leader, either internal or external, formal or informal, you have to make sure that people, that the group isn't so big that people don't have a place for them to make a meaningful contribution according to what they think is meaningful. Not you. You might say, hey, what's wrong with 4 guitar players? Well, any guitar player is going to say, no, that's a real pain in the butt. Maybe 2 at the most, but it's too much to coordinate 4. So you have to be thinking about making sure that all the people have a role where they can participate, and that the group size, you want to have that what's called optimal group size, right? Where it's not too small, it's just 4 of you, right? Because now we don't have enough people, but it's not 20 of you, so people don't have a role. Now, here's a thought. Let's just go back to the missions team example. What if 20 people do show up and stick around, right? You're going, wow, I got 4 guitar players, and I got 4 preachers, and I got 4, cooks, and I got, there's just a lot of redundancy here. Well, what you might want to do at that point is break them down into smaller groups. Now, you may notice in this MSL program, maybe you came in with a cohort of 15 or 25 people, right? Probably one of the first things they did was say, hey, you guys, why don't you break into small groups? It's easier to get to know 8 or 9 people than it is to get to know 20 or 13 people, right? 20 or 25 people. So this idea of bringing you together helps you to develop cohesiveness within your group in the program, okay? I hope you like that concept. If you do, you can thank me, because I'm the one that actually developed it in the program. If you don't, well, you can blame somebody else. That's a little inside baseball for you. Maybe that was too much information. Now, you might be saying, Frank, how do we increase group cohesion? Well, I'm glad you asked that. Here's some thoughts for you. Reach joint agreement on group goals. Make the group more homogeneous. Increase interaction among group members. Make the group smaller. Physically or socially isolate the groups. Allocate rewards to the group, not individuals, and give the group and members more responsibility. Okay, so I mentioned some of these things a little bit, but these are all good ideas. If you want your group to be stronger and more cohesive, you should do some of these things. Now, you might be saying, okay, at what point is a group, what's the optimal group cohesion? This slide here shows us that at a certain point, a cohesive group is optimally productive, right? So this axis here is productivity, and this axis here is cohesion. So as a group gets tighter and closer and feeling connected with the goals of the group and connected with one another, they perform really good. Now, what happens if they get too cohesive? You see they kind of keep going along this axis here. You'll see productivity goes down, and we say that too much cohesion is not too good. A group can actually become too cohesive. Wow, what's that about? Well, let's talk about over cohesion and the dynamic that brings to the group. Well, one of the big ones here is what's called groupthink. It's the downside to overly cohesive groups. What is groupthink? It's the deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment in the interest of group solidarity. And it can occur when a group is just a bit too cohesive, when cohesion is valued over performance. Now, here are some of the characteristics of groups suffering from groupthink: illusions of invulnerability, tendency to moralize, feeling of unanimity, pressure to conform, opposing ideas are dismissed. So anybody who thinks differently than the group is minimized, right? There has to be conformity. There has to be unanimity. We are the group. We are unstoppable. We are, we're going to make it. And so a group, when they become so cohesive, it's more important for them to think alike and to stay in line with one another than it is for productivity. And as you can, imagine, the groups that have this dynamic, all of a sudden they become insular, they become shut off, they're not in touch with reality anymore. And this essentially is the beginning of a cult right here, is when all of a sudden the group becomes convinced of its own inherent moral superiority. They cut themselves off from the outside world. They're not open to ideas. They're not open to accountability, right? So you kind of see the downside here, especially in a church context. This one is critical, you guys. You need to be aware of groupthink. And if you think about a lot of the situations where big leaders high-profile leaders have had a downfall, chances are at some point he or she had a group of other people who they call yes men, right? What's a yes man? If somebody says, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Oh yeah, we like that idea. Of course we can do that, right? And chances are you're sitting in a group and people are going, yeah, yes and amen. And you might be thinking, I don't know about that. It sounds like we're heading off a cliff here. But you feel this pressure to conform. You don't say anything because you don't want to be seen as an outsider. Everybody's going to give you that look like, how can you go against this, right? And again, this is kind of a cultural dynamic as well. Sometimes cultures are so, conflict averse, or there's such a high regard for the leader and his or her status that people don't want to say anything. Well, you can make the greatest contribution to your group by learning how to speak up, by speaking your mind. Especially, think about the things and the gifts and the perspective that the Lord has put into you that aren't in the rest of the group. It's important for you to speak up. It's important for you to bring your point of view, even when it doesn't go along with everybody else in the group. In fact, maybe even especially when it doesn't go along, right? Because the challenge and the what am I trying to say here? The path to an effective dynamic group is by everybody contributing, by everybody speaking up. And so if we all kind of, defer to one person, or if we don't say anything for the sake of harmony or false harmony, right? It's not a real harmony, right? We're not saying anything, but inside everybody's thinking, we're looking at each other. Is this really what we're going to do here? That's not really harmony, you guys. That is suppressed conflict that's going on there. And so the way to really make a strong contribution to your group is by being free to say things, by being free to offer ideas. Now you might say, well, if I do that, the leader is going to look at me askance, or he or she doesn't like that kind of thing. He or she doesn't like to be challenged. Well, you may be in the wrong group, okay? I'm just going to put it out there straight. If you're in a group dynamic where the leader does not like any countering opinions, you may be in the wrong group. You're probably already sensing it. You're probably already frustrated, right? Because you've experienced that dynamic. So you can either, leave the group or challenge the group or do what you can to change that group dynamic. But I'll tell you one thing, if you don't say anything and that group thing goes on, you guys are going to head off the cliff together. Now, nobody wants that to happen, right? So do what you can to break up that groupthink dynamic. And our textbook actually has some really good ideas on how to do that. I encourage you to read that. Now, this exhibit here shows the relationship between group cohesiveness and organizational goals. Now, as you can imagine, a group can be very cohesive, but if they're not aligned with organizational goals, that's not a good thing. In fact, a cohesive group not aligned with the organization can lead to a revolution. Now, I thought of a good biblical example here. Now, remember Saul and David, right? And we know David was the Lord's anointed, but Saul was the king for a good period in Israel's history. And at a certain point, Saul became jealous of David. And David went out on his own, right? And he was on his own, and he was worried about Saul. Saul was trying to kill him. And what happened? There's an interesting scripture somewhere there in Samuel. It says, and everybody who was discontent, and everybody who was, in need, and came to David. He was kind of like a magnet for all the malcontents in Israel at the time, right? He really was. And so he formed his own group, right? He formed his own countervailing structure. It wasn't part of Israel, but he demonstrated this leadership, and Saul was so jealous of him, right? Remember, Saul heard the girls singing, Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his tens of thousands, right? Well, so now all of a sudden you got some tension here between these two guys, and David forms his own group, and they're cohesive, and they love David, and they're loyal to David. They're ready to kill David. Now, we always say, yeah, David's the hero in this one. We know Saul's the bad guy, and eventually David's going to take over the kingdom. But think about this from Saul's perspective for a second, right? He's thinking, hey, I got this kingdom here, and I got this rebel over here trying to band together and come against me. So you can see why legitimately Saul was concerned about this, right? Now, so you might be saying, well, what does that have to do with me? Well, you might see a cohesive group within your organization, but they might be out of sync with the overall goals of the organization. Now, you might think it's nice that they're cohesive, but if they're so cohesive and they're out of line, you might be looking for trouble, right? So you always got to make sure that those goals are in line. What are they working on? How is their strategy keeping in line with the overall goal? You don't want them to be so strong that they kind of like, do their own thing. And this happens in churches too, right? Sometimes in a church, there's kind of a little group that kind of gathers around somebody. They don't like the main church, they don't like the service, they don't like the pastor, or whatever it is, and all of a sudden, bing, 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 boom, and before you know it, they do a church split, they do a church plant, right? And, let's face it, this is the stuff of history, right? Martin Luther was a guy, part of the church, but he had a different idea, and he threw his ideas out there. He bunk, 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 bunk. He nailed those ideas. What is it, 57 theses or however many theses? He nailed it on the Wittenberg wall, and all he wanted to do was have a lively conversation about church doctrine. He just saw some things that, in his opinion, were just a tad askew. And he wanted to have a conversation about those things. Well, leaders of the church said, no, we're not going to do that, right? And so before you know it, Martin Luther became the leader of this revolutionary movement, right? And they became cohesive, and boom, you had the Reformation. All of a sudden, like, the church was split, and you had wars and nations taking sides to the different loyalties, right? And so really this whole dynamic here that we're talking about is the stuff of church history, and maybe you've even seen the dynamic in church. So as a leader, what do you want to do? You got to get these things early. You got to nip it in the bud. You got to get these people aligned with the mission. Should you squash them? Should you kick them out of church? I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to go there. That's a decision you have to make. That's between you and the Lord. But you need to keep your eyes open for this dynamic taking place. Who's that? Oh, it's Licorice. That's Licorice. He's my dog. Now, what you've all been waiting for. I've been talking a lot about groups, but let's talk about teams. Now, the difference between a team and an immature developing group is that a team has a total commitment to the common goals and accountability to the team. And there's a lot of perceived gains from using teams: economic improvements, quality of productivity gains, flattening of an organizational structure, etc., etc. Now, let me add a couple other things here too. When you really are committed to the team structure, you are developing other leaders in your organization, especially in a church, right? When you empower people, when you allow people to function, to make their own goals, accountability, decisions, you're going to increase the leadership development of that team, right? So this is an important thing for church leaders especially, is to let people function as teams and to make their own decisions, not to micromanage them, not to dictate from outside what they're supposed to be doing. Let them function as a team, because what's going to happen? Leaders are going to flourish. Teams are leadership producing manufacturing entities, right? So if you're all concerned about the overall growth of the organization, let teams do their thing. Let people struggle. Let them, maybe even have some of the conflict. You come in, you use that hill model when you need to, but let people kind of do their thing, because teams are an important dynamic for individuals. And teams harness the capacity and the gifts of different people, right? So team composition is important because different people have different skills and gifts, and they will bring that to the group, right? And that's important, and they'll function in that capacity, and they'll function highly if they're a specialized person, they have a specialized ability, they can bring that skill to the team. Now, there's different types of teams: problem solving, cross-functional, virtual, R&D, self-managed. Some of these things are more or less applicable in a church. Most of us don't have R&D teams, right? But sometimes we have like problem solving teams. Sometimes there's what are called task force. We've got an issue situation, and so we bring together this temporary team. Sometimes we call these committees, right? In the church world, in the school world that I work in, we have a lot of committees that come together, permanent, temporary, to solve different kinds of problems. Now, team effectiveness. It's effective when the teams are empowered, when they're rewarded, when there's strong communication, and there's strong training, right? So I mentioned this before. If the team is not empowered, they're not going to be as effective, right? Because basically they're saying, all right, we're just going to, the leader's going to make all the decisions, so we're just going to wait for him or her to tell us. That's not a team at that point. That's a group with an outside leader. So people don't feel empowered. So if you take away the power for them to make decisions on their own, they're not going to function as effectively as a team. Rewards, let the team decide on what the rewards are. Let them reward each other. Give them the ability to reward each other. Communication, there has to be strong communication amongst the group members. And then training. And this is probably one of the biggest aspects of an effective functioning team. Because people know how to do their respective jobs on a team, right? But they don't know how to operate and to function together in the team dynamic. Nobody's ever taught them like the group dynamics and the team stages of formation and the leader's role, or told them how to communicate, or things like, what do we do when we reach an impasse? What do we do when we can't agree on a solution, right? Do we use Robert's Rules of Orders? Do we raise our hands? Do we pull out, the umum and the thummim? I mean, how are we going to make decisions when it gets tough? So teams need help and training in some of these kind of what I call housekeeping duties. Not the actual job of the team, but how the team functions together. That's typically where they need the training. And so if you want your team to be effective, you have to pay attention to their understanding of learning knowledge about team dynamics. And so I just mentioned training here, but here's some specific things: individual task skills, how to function as a team member, problem solving, creative thinking, and interpersonal skills. And this last one too is important too, right? Interpersonal skills. So again, some people are really good, they're real strong on that task, they get the task done. Hey, put me in, I'm going to do my thing, but they don't realize they've got to interact now with other people. So helping them to get along, helping their emotional intelligence, right, and their social sensitivity and all those sorts of things. Those are important skills for team members to grow in order for them to be effective. And how do we improve member effectiveness? To encourage open-mindedness, look for emotional stability, provide accountability, problem-solving abilities, communication skills, conflict resolution skills, and developing trust amongst the team is important as well. Now, communication amongst the team is important. They require information that used to be management's exclusive domain. Managers often fear a loss in their decision-making power. Many teams fail due to management's unwillingness to share information with the team it created. Now, if you really are committed to a team model, that means somebody has lost some power and authority. And this is the biggest problem with teams, especially in a church context, right? Because we have this kind of, here it is, we got Jesus here, and we got the senior pastor here, and then everybody else is somewhere down here, right? Well, if you're committed to a team approach, you have to say, all right, team leaders, teams, I'm trusting you all to be in alignment with the goals of the church, to be, in touch with the Spirit's leading in your life, and with the maturity and the skills that, that have been invested in you. I'm trusting you. And so the manager now has to become comfortable. And by manager, I might mean, even the senior pastor or maybe executive pastors or whatever level the team is functioning under. But you have to become comfortable with having less authority and less power directly over the team. And that's a challenge. This is a big reason, hear me on this, the big reason why teams fail is because management is uncomfortable with getting out of the way. They're uncomfortable with empowering others, they're uncomfortable with letting other people make these decisions. Okay, so if you're committed to the team idea, the number one thing you have to ask yourself is, do I have the stomach for the turmoil and some of the conflict that may ensue during this team development, team formation stage? And you might say, no, I don't. I have a very low tolerance for ambiguity. I have a very high risk aversion, right? I like control. I like order. I believe that I'm the supreme, authority in the church. Maybe it's a theological hang-up that you have. And so teams might not work for you, right? So you're going to have to deal with some of those things in your own makeup and disposition if you're really committed to making a team approach work. And empowerment, regardless of the type of team, those that lack authority are less effective. It suggests that management doesn't trust the team. It is at the root of team empowerment problems. Teams can also be given too much authority, particularly true during the early stages of team development. Training can help members use authority effectively. Okay, so on the other hand, right, as much as we say that empowerment is important, you have to do it in a way that makes sense for the stage, the maturity level, and the capability of the team. So I'm not saying, hey, step away and just like, okay, whatever happens here with this team, I'm going to trust them, I'm empowering them. No, you got to use some wisdom and say, here at the early formation stages, I'm going to provide some assistance, I'm going to provide some training wheels, some scaffolding, whatever metaphor helps you to understand this, but you have to provide some help for them as they develop And then at a certain point, you're saying, hey, look at them. You know, he's riding the bike all by himself. You go, Johnny. You pedal that bike. I'm so proud of you. You just go. And then pretty soon Johnny's out of sight, and he grows up, and he graduates high school, and he goes to college, and he gets married and has kids, and you never see him again. Oh, wait a minute. I'm talking about my life here. Okay. So let's back up. Okay. So you want to empower them, but you want to do it. It must be getting late. You want to do it in a way that's judicious and makes sense, and not give them too much authority for their stage of development. And then, of course, rewards. Most reward systems are individual based. To the extent that teams perform well, the team should be rewarded. And reward systems can be incentive based or a form of profit sharing. Now, again, in the church, we don't do a lot of profit sharing, do we? But we can find ways to reward teams for their good behavior. And again, we're dealing with a lot of volunteers, or maybe people that don't make a lot of money. You have to find other ways to incentivize and motivate them, right? So go back to our talk on motivation and rewards and think about, how can I reward this team as a whole for their performance as opposed to individual? Here's the challenge with this one. You might say, okay, I'm going to reward the team leader, or I'm going to reward a star performer, right? That's going to create some tension within the team. Now, we know in professional sports that happens all the time, right? Where you've got the star quarterback who's making $5 million a year, and your linebackers are making like $200,000 a year. Now, they're still going to show up. I mean, let's face it, getting $200,000 a year for going like this, and blocking people, it's still a sweet gig, right? But it's not $5 million. So I don't know. I've never worked on a sports team. I'm not sure what the conversations are like about compensation in the locker room, but I'm sure they're interesting. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about here are what are called roles in a team, and using different roles. Different people serve different roles in a team setting. Now, I mentioned earlier, I talked about sort of the task-oriented people and the social-oriented people. That's an example of different roles. But there's an approach here called Belbin's team role approach, and this can help teams really thrive. And so if you look at the Belbin model, what you'll see here is that people play different roles in teams. Let's take a look at this model. Now, you might not be able to see this, but I'm going to make this available online so you can see this chart. But you'll see the different roles here, and they have different creative names, like the plant, who's creative, imaginative, free-thinking, generates ideas, and solve difficult problems. There's the resource investigator. They're enthusiastic, communicative, explores opportunities, and develops contacts. And then the coordinator, these are mature, confident, identify talent, clarify goals. Shaper, monitor, team worker, implementer. Okay, so there's all these different roles here. Now, you'll also see that there's a weakness here, right? So for the plant, this is the creative, imaginative, free-thinking person, but the downside is here that they ignore incidentals. That's a detail. They're too preoccupied to communicate effectively, right? And so for every strength, right, and this is true in teams and just individuals, right? There's a strength, there's always a corresponding weakness. So people that are visionary, creative, typically are not as grounded, detail-oriented, conscientious, good on follow-through, right? Remember individual difference conversation we had a couple weeks ago, right? So this is the same dynamic in a team, right? So people are going to bring different personalities and roles in a team based on their personalities and strengths and abilities. And that's going to be a blessing to the team, but it's also going to have some shortcomings. So I encourage you to check out the Belbin team role model idea. I'm going to provide a link in our course materials for you to investigate this even further. You can even do an assessment. Now, it's not a free assessment, but if you like this idea, you might want to take it or bring it back to your team, or just print out this chart and say, hey, where do we see different people? Because the idea is that as a leader, either internal or external, if you can figure out where people's sweet spot is within a team and help them to excel in that role, it's going to be a benefit to the team, right? So if you have a person that's kind of the creative, free-thinking visionary, you don't want to saddle that person with a lot of administrative details, that requires too much conscientiousness that this person just doesn't bring, right? So kind of thinking about individual differences within a team dynamic, I guess, is the big idea here. Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? But I hope that was helpful for you. I hope that was useful for you. I'm going to put on my team hat. Go Team Fender. You guys are going to have some opportunities this week to discuss team dynamics in the discussion board. But before we go, hang on. I want to introduce you to one of the important team members of Team Markow. Now, everybody, this is Licorice. Say hi, Licorice. He was just napping. He's not very happy. But he plays an important role on Team Markow. He's the one who loafs around. He makes sure that the carpet stays nice and warm. He makes sure that the dog food gets eaten. He makes sure that little brown piles of poop are spread over the backyard. But he also barks when bad people come too. So he's kind of our little early alert system. It's an important role in the team, right? Everybody's got to have a role on the team, and Licorice has his role. All right? Say goodbye, Licorice. Bye. Well, that's it for now, you guys. Blessings to all. See you online.